desejo a vocês um bom curso e nos vemos aqui na quarta-feira para a conferência aberta. Obrigada.
Bom dia. Obrigada a todos pela presença. Queria agradecer a presença da Mary. I will start introducing in Portuguese and then I will switch to English in a moment.
You don't have to reintroduce me in English.
Eu queria primeiro agradecer ao ProURB, a coordenação do ProURB na figura da Adriana, Sansão, Denise e Pinheiro Machado, que viabilizaram a vinda da Mary através do programa CAP Sprint. A gente montou esse curso a partir de uma parceria com 3 instituições, o ProURB, o ProPar da URBS e o MDU da Universidade Federal de Pernambuco, a partir de uma relação iniciada em 3 frentes, com a professora Mary McLeod, por mim, pelo professor Sérgio Marques e pela Mônica Boa e pela professora Aguilar Naslavski, de Pernambuco. Então, a partir dessa tríplice frente aí de contato com a professora Mary McLeod lá em Nova York, que nos recebeu, nos orientou e nos acolheu lá na Colômbia, a gente começou a organizar esse curso e a vinda dela para cá. Então, o curso envolve as 3 instituições. O curso é composto por 5 aulas. Originalmente, algumas aulas aqui no Rio, outras em Porto Alegre e outras em Recife. Devido às circunstâncias lá da enchente no Rio Grande do Sul, tivemos que remanejar e então as aulas passaram a ser somente aqui no Rio e em Recife, mas os alunos e professores de Porto Alegre estão nos acompanhando pelo Zoom. Então, o curso é composto por 5 aulas, as aulas vão ser hoje, amanhã e quarta. E depois, na próxima semana, quarta e sexta-feira, dias 5 e 7 de junho, sempre nesse horário de 10 a 1. São 5 aulas, vou repassar aqui rapidamente o título das 5 aulas. A primeira é Women, Gender and Architectural History. A segunda é Issues of Gender in Architecture. A terceira é Women and the Modern Domestic Environment. Estão dizendo no Zoom que não estão ouvindo. Tem que falar mais perto. Agora ouvem. Eu estou falando com vocês e com eles. A quarta aula é Women and the Modern Domestic Environment, parte 2. Case Study, Liberated Living, Charlotte Perriand and Domestic Reform. E a quinta aula é Mass Culture, Post-War Consumerism, Everyday Life, The Smithsons, Ventura Scott Brown e Jane Jacobs. Então, o curso é composto por essas 5 aulas. Hoje a gente vai iniciar com Women, Gender and Architectural History. Now I will switch to English and do a short introduction about Mary McLeod. She's a professor of architecture at Columbia GCEP, where she teaches architectural history and theory and occasionally studio. She has also taught at Harvard University, University of Kentucky, University of Miami, and the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies. Her research and publications have focused on the history of modern movement and on contemporary architecture theory, examining issues concerning the connections between architecture and ideology. Mary is co-editor of Architecture, Criticism, Ideology, and Architecture Reproduction, and is the editor and contributor of the book Charlotte Perriand, An Art of Living. She has received numerous fellowships and awards, including a Fulbright Fellowship, an NEH Award, and grants from New York Council and New York Council of the Arts and the Graham Foundation. So Mary, we'd like to thank you so much for coming here to Rio, to Recife. We'd like to thank the students from all over Brazil that are watching us, and the students that are present here. And I will give the word to you.
Can everybody see me down here still? Okay. First, a warm thank you to Mara, Sergio Verpez, Gila, Naslavsky, Monica, and also all the administrators, Adriana, Denise, Guillermo for all their help organizing this 3-university event. I'm just sad. It's wonderful to be back in Brazil. It's at least 10 years since I've been here. The last smaller Docomomo was the last time, I think, in Sao Paulo. Is the mic working, Mara? It's working? Okay. And it's almost 20 years since I've been in Rio, so it's a real thrill to be back. The only thing I'm very sad about, mostly for the country, is that I personally can't get to Porto Alegre, but and I just feel for the residents there what they're going through. But I'm glad for Zoom. We all learned how to use it during COVID, so hopefully some of the students can join us. I'm going to start today with a very general lecture on why I think this topic is important. Then and in terms of the general structure of the class, I'll usually begin with a talk, then we'll take a break for 15 minutes or whatever, and then hopefully have discussion. Depending on the discussion today, I don't know how many of you had a chance to read part of the Despina Strategakis readings or not. I know some students were going to lead with questions. I have a few for you all as well. I might also show some images about gender in architecture more historically, depending on time. Yeah, I was... Okay, so let's start. It seems to be cut off a little bit, Mara. I don't know if it could be full screen. Or is that turned soon? That's better. Is this the PDF or
Yes,
the PDF? I prefer a point. Is it too hard to reestablish? I can't just click on the PDF? I think I can. If you go back to the PDF for a second, it should be able to just press down for the next image. Okay. Is it on right now? Sorry for the slight interruption. Okay, great. By the way, I know you're all very brave to be listening to a lecture in English. If there's something that's unclear, please feel free to interrupt me or raise your hand.
Just if you are turning the microphone, just take out one press this button.
Okay. Anyway, let's begin. In this talk today, and I'll go back and forth between reading and improvising a little, I want to address how architecture history might become more inclusive of issues concerning women and gender, and focusing especially on feminist concerns. And I know to some students of architecture this may seem almost an irrelevant topic, given that many architecture schools, now really around the world, have more than 50%, at least here clearly from the audience, and in the US, but also increasingly in Europe, more than 50% women students and numerous faculty, and even in many cases, deans. And just before I show you an array of women deans in the US, I think this quote from Kathleen James Chakrabarty really signals my own concern. Why, basically, has half the human race been ignored in so many architectural history books and courses, until perhaps very recently. But things are definitely changing. This is a little out of date, but here are several deans of major schools in the US, all women, and I have to say this changed. Only 10 years ago, the Ivy League schools did not have women deans with the exception of Penn. In addition, you may wonder, there's been a rich body of feminist scholarship in architectural history that's been published since the 1970s. Probably the very first book in English, and I'm glad to hear about other books in Portuguese or Spanish if you have them, was Doris Cole's little book, From TV to Skyscraper, A History of Women in Architecture, 1973. So it's literally 50 years ago.
Sorry to interrupt. There is just a problem that the image is not showing for the ones that are on Zoom.
Okay.
I was asking to do a short introduction. Just
Okay. We're apparently having Zoom coordination issues, so just a minute. But by the way, while we're waiting, this little book by Doris Cole, who was one of the early, I would say, architectural feminists in the Cambridge area of Massachusetts, the Japanese now want to translate. So 50 years later, it has a new kind of currency. Okay, we're going to just do a check to see if it's working on Zoom. But while we're checking, the other book that's on the screen, I don't know how many of you know it in Latin America. It was by Susanna Torre, an Argentine architect who came to New York, who edited this amazing collection of essays and, more important, maybe even curated a traveling show called Women in American Architecture, a Historic and Contemporary Perspective in 1977. And I think this may have been the very first general survey of women architects, again, an exhibition perhaps in the world. But again, my knowledge of here is very North American centric, so please correct me if there are earlier precedents. There were a few monographic shows on women architects before it, but this was really groundbreaking at the time. And this was very shortly followed by some of the authors in that catalog of Torre by early studies, which Dolores Hayden used the phrase material feminism. I'll come back to this later. Two studies, The Grand Domestic Revolution and Gwendolyn Wright's Moralism in the Model Home, as well as an issue of Heresies, which I gave you a PDF of to look at, which was an early feminist, from a feminist journal that came out in 1981 called Making Room. And this is kind of amazingly prescient with articles on Eileen Gray in English. I gave you one of the translations from it, an early feminist manifesto, etc. But by the 1980s, late 80s and 90s, these publications were followed in the States by a plethora of books, often addressing gender from a more theoretical, here's pages from Heresies first, followed, as I just mentioned, just a few years later in the late 80s and early 90s, by books that were more dealing with gender as a theoretical or rhetorical issue. Sexuality in space, architecture and fashion, architecture and feminism, architecture in the everyday, by 96, to name just a few. And it was during this same period that the first studies of queer theory and masculinity were published. For example, a former Columbia student of mine, but also studied at Princeton, Henry Urbach, wrote this book dealing with the whole issue and reality of closets, published in Assemblage. Or Joel Sanders, another former Columbia student, but also associated with Princeton, this book called Stud, introducing issues of masculinity and architecture. 96, the publication date of both. But then, I think this is important to acknowledge, there was a lull in feminist studies, at least in the US, until the last 6 to maybe 8 years or so. But of course, feminist scholarship never fully stopped. And now, once again, I think spurred by the Me Too movement and an increasing awareness that the glass ceiling still persists in a professional practice, something I'd like to hear about vis-a-vis Brazil, feminist history and criticism in architecture seems to be flourishing again. And there's just a plethora of books that come out. Among the many writers of this last wave of feminist scholarship, and I'd like to cite specifically, but it's admittedly a rather arbitrary list, Anne-Marie Adams in Canada, Laurie Brown, Karen Burns in Australia, Elizabeth Darling in England, Despina Stratigakis, Mary Pepchinsky in Germany, Mary Woods in the US, Katja Frey and Ileana Periotti, who worked together in Switzerland, and 3 somewhat younger scholars, Sigal Dabidi from Israel, Essie Esterer, US again, but also Vienna, and Andrea Merritt. But the list, of course, is much, much longer. And what is, here are just more of these books, some of which I'm sure you know. And what is exciting, and some more, there really are so many. I could add a few more slides like this. And of course, I'm thrilled to see the Brazilian book on Jeanette Costa. What is exciting to me in this recent work is the broad range of issues being explored, extending from women's institutions, housing reform, and urban issues, to even examining women designers whose political sympathies we might not share or even find repulsive. It took a lot of courage to deal with bad women, such as Despina Stratigakis' fascinating study of Gertie Trost and gender identity in Hitler at Home. She was a strong, interesting woman, but also a full-fledged Nazi. So why, given these changes in architectural education and the impressive body of feminist scholarship, do I still believe there's a need to diversify further architectural history with regard to women and gender? For me, the answer is simple. It is apparent that this rich research has not entered, at least sufficiently, architectural history survey books and the teaching of architectural history in the schools. This is especially true, I think, of general lecture courses, at least in the States, but I hear it's very much the case in Europe as well. In short, the situation, at least until recently, is dismal and has been almost since the beginning of English language surveys of modern architecture. As 2 early examples, I would like to cite Nicholas Pevsner's Pioneers of the Modern Movement, 1936, later retitled Pioneers of Modern Design, and Siegfried Gideon's Space, Time, and Architecture, originally published in 1941. Probably the most influential book for my generation of architects. It went into multiple editions, translated in multiple languages. I think has later been replaced by other books like Frampton and Curtis. And in my admittedly quick review, I found almost nothing in these first two pioneering surveys about women. There's one passing reference in Pevsner's first edition to the MacDonald sisters, who worked, of course, with Mackintosh in Glasgow. And in Gideon's first edition, the only woman who appears in the index is the painter Berthe Morisot, in a list of artists who contributed to an exhibition. In the third edition of Space Time, in the late 40s, after the death of Ino Alto, he acknowledges her in a warm passage, almost as if he feels guilty about the previous omission of her name. He mentions, however, that Alto had always insisted on her co-authorship of designs, although then Gideon remarks, almost as if he's justifying his previous omission of someone who was actually a close personal friend, that she never saw herself as, quote, the creative one. To be fair to Gideon, however, in his 1948 book, shortly following, Mechanization Takes Command, presents another history, which I'll return to shortly. This troubling track record would continue until the last decade. Something to be fixed?
The audio is not working.
Oh,
so
no.
You have to talk very close to the mic.
Okay. If it gets too loud,
Yeah.
I don't know what we'll do. Okay, next. In what remains one of the finest books, I believe, on the modern movement, Rainer Banham's Theory and Design in the First Machine Age of 1960, I found, again, just one woman in the index, Margit Krohaller, and as late as 1996, Richard Weston's marvelously illustrated volume, Modernism, includes no women among its biographical entries at the back. Nor are the books by the leftist historian Manfredo Tafori much better. In both Architecture and Utopia and Theories in History, women simply don't exist, though the situation improves slightly in Modern Architecture and The Spear in the Labyrinth. And things remain much the same at the turn of the century. Alan Cahoon, in his 2002 History of Modern Architecture, made no mention of Eileen Gray, Charlotte Perriand, or Ino Alto. Anthologies of theoretical writings are almost as bad. Especially surprising given the prominent role of women in this arena. One of the most egregious examples, at least for me, is Harry Mulgrave's huge 2-volume anthology. While you might expect the first volume, From Vitruvius to 1870, not to include many women, and needless to say, there are none. Is it working?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, sorry. There are none. The second volume, from 1871 to 2005, is only marginally better. Out of 326 entries, there are only 9 texts solely by women and 6 co-authored ones. That is a total of less than 5%. And no women in the section beyond the new millennium. In other words, all the feminist architectural theorists and historians of the last 30 years or so are excluded, whether we're talking about Diana Agras, Jennifer Bloomer, Beatrice Colomina, Dolores Hayden, Joan Achman, Susanna Torrey, I could go on. Absolutely no writings included by them at all. Of all the earlier survey books, Kenneth Frampton's of 1980 is by far the best, where at least women's names appear regularly as collaborators or clients. Though curiously, Eileen Gray doesn't make it until a later edition, and I also found it very funny. I think I teased Kenneth about this, and he includes it in a later edition, but as a so-called specialist of concrete. And if there's one area Eileen Gray was not, it was a specialist of concrete, having worked on the restoration of E1027. However, there are grounds for some hope. Both John Louis Cohen's 2012, The Future of Architecture Since 1889, and Kathleen James Chakrabarty's 2014, Architecture Since 1400, include numerous names of women as collaborators, as well as illustrations of work by contemporary women designers. However, in the case of Cohen's book, like Frampton's survey, the number of names is so vast and the references are so fleeting that they provide little knowledge about the specific contributions and sensibilities that these women bring. In other words, they give a lot of names, but not yet much recognition to their specific contributions. How might this issue be further addressed? What approaches have feminist scholars used that might be incorporated or adapted in future surveys as well as lecture courses? And in the rest of this talk, I shall try to outline several strategies, and I'd like to stress that none of these are particularly new or original, as they are drawn from feminist scholarship of the past 40 years. Some of them, I believe, might also be relevant to other studies of gender in architecture and landscape, including queer and trans subjects, which seem to be increasingly important, at least in the States, but I think part of Western Europe as well. The first one I'm calling Beyond Names, biographies, monographs, exhibitions. From my quick survey of surveys, it might seem inclusion should be the first step. However, this strategy I would propose needs to go beyond name dropping to discuss the careers and projects of women designers as practitioners who had or have careers and histories in their own right. This will require more monographs, biographies, and exhibitions of women architects. And just as important, maybe more so, scholars who will read and absorb these monographic studies when they teach or write new surveys. Such studies allow us to discern women's specific contributions, as well as to understand the broader social, institutional, and personal factors that allowed some women to practice, especially in a period when many did not, and that shaped the nature of their practice. In other words, they would help us not just learn about individual women, but encourage us to approach history from different perspectives, thus potentially changing architectural history itself. Monographs and biographies were not, in saying that, I mean getting beyond sort of the celebration of the male heroic genius, stylistic innovation is the only criteria. We could go on about that. Monographs and biographies were not especially popular when the theory wave hit architecture in the 1990s. Indeed, some feminist architectural critics dismissed them as tokenism, or what they called recuperative history. What Victoria Rosner, my co-editor on a website, Pioneering Women in American Architecture, calls, quote, put them in the pot and stir it. And judging from the recent Aggregate panel at Columbia, by the way, do any of you know Aggregate? It's a recent architectural history collective in the States. There's still a huge aversion to monographs. In fact, one woman historian called it ridiculous. And I was kind of shocked and asked her, did you really say that? And she said, absolutely. But I would argue, as many feminist scholars have in other fields, that monographs or individual studies are essential, not just in diversifying architectural history or in offering role models. More detailed studies of individual women practitioners also challenge at times prevailing gender assumptions. For example, that women did not make technological inventions, or that until recently women didn't design skyscrapers. Here, for example, are images of Anna Kickling's inventions. She was an early 20th century designer in Pennsylvania, patented something like 23 inventions, including what was an early example of the concrete block, and also did model kitchens, etc. Or the stereotype that women can't do skyscrapers, where in fact we do have examples, and of course continue to today, of where women were the lead designers. Whether the unbuilt project in Luc Han's office, where Anne Ting was without question the main designer, or Natalie DeBlois, who worked for SOM and was responsible, in my view, for some of their most really beautiful work, including the Pepsi-Cola building in New York City. In the case of early European women practitioners, we are still missing book-length studies, at least in English, of so many fascinating early women architects and housing reformers. I think, for example, of Ella Briggs, an amazing Austrian woman architect who also worked in the States for a period. By the way, I'm hoping a monograph on her will come out soon. Marlene Moshe Polzeg, who designed Polzeg's own house when they were married. He did not do it. Helena Sirkis, a leading Polish architect. We have a collection of her letters that just came out, but no monograph yet on her work. Ingrid Wahlberg, an important Swedish modernist. Elsa Godoni, who worked in Israel and the States. Lotte Besse, who worked mostly in the Netherlands. Marta Blomstad in Finland, to name just a few. And I'm just hoping more work will continue to be done on these women, and I'm sure there's some real zillion candidates who also need studies as well. I think the impact of this monographic approach is self-evident. Once a series of articles, books, and exhibitions arrived about Eileen Gray, Charlotte Perriand, and Lena Bobardi, to cite 3 examples, their names began to show up regularly in lecture courses and history books. And sometimes I would say it took 5 or 6 of these monographic studies for this to happen. We almost have industries on people like Charlotte Perriand and Lena Bobardi, but they're finally now in survey books. Second strategy, I'm calling expansion of the boundaries of architecture. And this will have to do with my 3rd and 4th presentations in this group little series. I would like to suggest that we need to look at architecture itself from a broader perspective. It's commonly accepted that the boundaries of architecture have changed over the centuries, from churches and palaces in the Renaissance and Baroque periods, to include public institutions in the 18th and 19th century, things like libraries, museums, courthouses, etc., to housing after World War I. Remember, the last chapter of Le Corbusier's Towards a New Architecture is mass-produced housing. That was not considered part of architecture for most of the Beaux-Arts training in the 19th century. Nicholas Pevsner's distinction between the Lincoln Cathedral and the bicycle shed has proven, I would propose, not always to be so clear. And obviously one classic example is Le Corbusier's Cabanon. In my view, one of the brilliant contributions of the first feminist studies in the US, and I'll probably go back to this tomorrow, was to challenge such distinctions by focusing on domestic reform. Dolores Hayden and Gwendolyn Wright, whom I mentioned a second ago, presented new protagonists and new historical lineages as they showed how Catherine Beecher in the 19th century, Charlotte Perkins Gilman at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, Christina Frederick in the early 20th century, and here's her famous diagram of kitchen reform, among others, challenged traditional notions of the family home, introducing innovations to reduce household labor, whether streamlined kitchens or kitchenless housing, such as apartment hotels. And it's clear, if you've looked at the history of books in the 20s and 30s in Europe, that Frederick's studies like this greatly influenced both European women domestic reformers and architects, evident in Bruno Taut's use of Christine Frederick's diagrams, or in the collaboration of Erna Meyer in kitchen designs at the Weissenhof Siedlung. In a similar vein, other feminist historians have emphasized the role of women in the creation of vernacular architecture. A very interesting paper by Gila that I hope she'll present in the last class is an example of that. Interior design, landscape design, housing, like studies on Catherine Bauer, urban planning, exhibitions, exhibition design, architectural preservation, architectural organizations, and criticism. In other words, I believe when those of us writing architectural and landscape history take a more comprehensive view of our fields, the inclusion of women, as well as minorities and other marginalized groups, becomes a relatively easy task. Perhaps one of the earliest examples, in fact, is that person I just denigrated, Siegfried Gideon, whose book of 1948, Mechanization Takes Command, An Anonymous History, one of my very favorite books, might be seen as a foil to space, time, and architecture. He includes a lot of these early women domestic reformers from the 19th century to the early 20th century. A second strategy, depending on time today, we might go back to, I'm calling rhetoric and gender construction. Earlier, I alluded briefly to the focus in feminist studies of the 90s on gender constructions in architectural rhetoric. This work, and I think this is really the focus of the Adrian Forte essay I put on the recommended, not required, reading for the class today. This work helped elucidate the gendering of styles, which I think goes way back. For example, the traditional denigration of Rococo as feminine, even if figures such as the Goncourt brothers in France in the late 19th century celebrated it for just those reasons. Likewise, these studies showed how notions such as ornament and structure were frequently gendered, whether in the classical past or in more contemporary discussions around historicist postmodernism and deconstructivism. So here, the contrast between Christopher Wren, who denigrated the influence of women in France in a famous letter from 1666, to showing the so-called feminine style later in the early 18th century of Rococo, which gets both celebrated at the time and in the late 19th century, but also denigrated in other periods where Rococo is just dismissed. But turning more to the more recent past, why, for example, is the rhetoric of some deconstructivist theory filled with such violent metaphors, and I'm using words from this catalog of MoMA, as destruction, demolition, slash, crash, torture, monstrosity, all words that fill this catalog? Might we even see the notion of radical or experimental architecture still rooted in notions of what I'd call puerile avant-gardism that underplay many of women's quieter forms of innovation? And I would just encourage you really to analyze the rhetoric of treatises and when radicality really takes on kind of masculine or militant overtones. And finally, to what extent does the rhetoric in architectural journalism and criticism continue to perpetuate the cult of the individual genius creator, almost always male in its celebration of star architecture? Next strategy, including more on institutions and organizations. An examination of institutions and organizations, that is schools, museums, professional and general press, professional societies, can also bring women and gender issues to the fore. Among the questions they might help us address are: when did educational and professional institutions become open to women? I'm very eager to learn more about Brazil in this, with regard to this issue. What are their roles and status within professional organizations? Do glass ceilings still operate within them? And in the US, we certainly still feel this. For instance, FAIA, the most prestigious status, still has less than 10% women architects included. But, or more positively, has the collective character of some organizations allowed women to make substantial contributions and gain recognition? Traditionally, architectural history, in its emphasis on artistic innovation, has neglected to consider women's role as educators, critics, curators, and participants in professional organizations. Recently, this has begun to change. For example, Rick Hostra's account of Helena Sirkis's role in CM, Jill Saden's research on Sadie Spade's contributions to the Architectural Review, and Juliet Kitchen's writings on female design curators at the Museum of Modern Art. Always secondary, by the way, to the male architectural curators, but they had a huge role. But once again, this work has not entered into general survey books or courses, or even more specialized studies of these organizations. One book that recently came out, I mentioned Helena Sirkis's letters to do with Congrès International d'Architecture Moderne, I hope will begin to challenge our image of CM as an organization. In proposing to focus on organizations and institutions, however, I would like to stress that this will require an approach quite distinct from that used by many architectural historians, who, following the model of Michel Foucault, tend to emphasize institutional structures and techniques, and this is true of the aggregate group in the US, with minimal regard to the issues that have inhibited women's participation or the actual structures of these organizations that preclude them. Another very important strategy that I think one book more than any other book in terms of modern architectural history challenge is patronage. And that book is Alice Friedman's superb book, Women in the Making of the Modern House, 1998, which for me and I think many feminist historians is an important model. Here, Friedman shows how a series of strong, creative women helped shape both the program and forms of many of the iconic modern houses. And what remains a mystery to me is why so few men in their survey books don't include this book in their bibliographies or acknowledge, as one of the chapters shows, that Trude Schroeder contributed significantly to the design of the Schroeder House. This chapter is co-written by Mary Stella Costiato. And what becomes clear when you read this chapter is very much as much as Rietveld, many of the really innovative features of the house, the flexibility of space, changing from night, day, etc., were her invention or suggestion. They worked very closely together, even if the aesthetic, the colors, etc., are Rietveld. In the case of patronage, women might readily be featured more prominently as well in earlier historical periods, as Alice Friedman's first book, A Wollerton Hall in England, or Sophie Marinez's book, it's really an excellent study, and Mademoiselle Montpensier in 17th century France have shown. Women weren't just important patrons in the 20th century. And we even are beginning to have this studies of women patrons. For instance, Turhan Sultan, there's a study, or some Asian women patrons in Japan and China. But this leads me to my next point, where the boundaries between patronage get blurry, and that is collaboration. As I already noted, some recent surveys regularly cite women such as Charlotte Perriand, Lily Wright, and Ray Eames as collaborators along with their better-known male partners. But again, the notion of collaboration might be extended beyond names in photo captions to include discussion about their actual work and the nature of their collaboration. How did Lily Wright's, for instance, give color and texture, one might say warmth, to Mies van der Rohe's interiors? And in my view, she made many of them really sing, with emerald green covers to the Barcelona chair, or this magnificent silk pavilion that she designed with him. Or how did Ray Eames bring whimsy and life to what might have been otherwise a rather straightforward, boxy house. Or how did Perriand and women reformers, and you're going to get more of this, probably more than you need, such as Paulette Bernège, transform Le Corbusier's notion of domestic service space? And how did Elizabeth Denby, which I'll also come back to, in her proposals for a daycare center, stroller, bicycle storage, women and youth recreational facilities, helped make Kensal House one of the first modernist housing complexes in England, in London, usually attributed only to Maxwell Fry, as the MoMA catalog did till they were corrected, one of the most innovative projects in Britain in the 1930s. The contributions of these women are well covered by feminist scholars, but have yet to enter the survey books and thus the reading lists of many lecture courses. But beyond this, does collaboration itself need to be examined with a wider lens to include consultants, engineers, and a greater diversity of office practitioners? Why were some architectural offices more hospitable to early women designers than others, and why? And it's very interesting to me, as somebody who worked probably too long in Le Corbusier, how his office had many more women than most French offices in the period. And we need to think, why is that? Not necessarily because he was a leading feminist, but maybe because of the modernist ideas that the office endorsed. Something to think further about. This same strategy of thinking more broadly about collaboration will, I believe, allow us to uncover the significant contributions of minority designers as well. As Roberta Washington and Anat Fabel discovered in their research on African-American architect Georgia Louise Harris Brown, who made structural calculations for Mies van der Rohe's promontory in 860 Lakeshore Drive apartments. You see her in this photo of her working on those things. And as many of you, I don't know how many have looked at the entry that Anat Fabel, or her essay on Harris Brown, but she also, of course, had a career in Brazil. Last, I'd like to conclude with a broader question, though one very relevant, I think, to issues we're facing today. And that is, why have so many recent efforts to, quote, decolonize architectural history, whether to examine race, well, let's call this section intersectionality. Why have these efforts to decolonize architectural history on the one hand, and to investigate economic, legal, and institutional issues on the other, efforts that I would like to stress I fully embrace, tend to ignore women and gender? Is this because these scholars feel that the feminists, and there are exceptions, I have to admit that, but why, for instance, this aggregate group I mentioned, often just ignore issues of women? Is this because these scholars feel that the feminist battle has been won? Or is it simply that the desire to see architecture through different lenses has led us to the neglect of other approaches that address diversity? Undoubtedly, it is sometimes necessary to focus on fighting one's own battle to bring an issue to fore. But as many feminists soon realized, class and race inevitably intersected with their own struggles for equality, social justice, and structural transformation. And many, echoing Kimberly Shinshaw's pioneering work in the late 1980s and 90s, have argued passionately for an intersectional recasting of feminism. In other words, that we can't look at women's issues apart from race. We can't look at race apart from also thinking about women's issues and class. I would like to stress the necessity of this in architectural history, and to cite in conclusion 2 positive examples that do just that, or maybe we want to call it 3. Mario Goodin's discussion in his book Black Space, and more recently Jacqueline Taylor's amazing monograph on the Black lesbian feminist architect Ameza Lee Meredith, who was also the first modernist working in Virginia, a southern border state in the US, who designed her own house for her partner and herself. And Mary Wood's book on Indian, South Asian women architects practicing in Mumbai and Delhi. There are, of course, other studies I could cite, but these are ones that I found particularly rich and helpful. And if you'll allow me one last question, I'd like to ask, is it time for us, that is for people like me working as architectural historians, to stop being afraid of studying how personal lives intersect with the production of architecture? I'd just like to remind you of the famous Woman Lives slogan in the late 60s and early 70s, the personal is political. Thank you. Okay. Should we take a break or do you want a break? What do you prefer, immediate questions or a break first? Any quick questions? Oops. Any quick questions on the talk, or should we take a break first? Is one question? Oh, just a photograph. Okay. Let's take a 15-minute break, and then we'll reassemble.
Pessoal, dos alunos que estão inscritos no curso regularmente aqui no ProURB, tem alguém que esteja aqui engajado para a discussão de hoje, que a gente separou naqueles grupos. Você é a Diana, tem mais alguém? Os outros eu acho que estão online, então. There were some problems with the sound when we are recording, so I wrote for the students not too hard, because for me, Portuguese, when I look at it, it's not as difficult. I can pick out words between Latin, French, and Italian, but when I hear it,
It's very hard. And for me, I began speaking English when I was young. But after, as I lived then when I speak another language, the first one is French. Then the English is very, very good.
I understand because I used to speak really pretty good French, and I haven't had a chance to use it. And my reading is fine because I read, but it's passive now.
Yes, it's like me. But you like to just very, very good biographical the déplacement. Maintenant, je pense un peu voir comme ça. Oui. Et aujourd'hui, nous avons de ces capacités. Nous avons eu des déplacements par un bénéfice du personnel, de la dimension quotidienne. Et nous avons eu à nouveau, ici au Petit, une sorte de la dimension biographique, comme si on était en faisant l'éloge de l'individu. Et non en comprenant justement les côtés collaboratifs. Je ne sais pas si ça reste ici. Mais ici, c'est très difficile. Par exemple, là, j'ai eu l'occasion, ce texte que je voudrais montrer à Jean-Louis, mais peut-être que vous pouvez aussi voir qu'est-ce qu'il faut que je fasse. J'ai étudié beaucoup à nouveau le style de avec sa famille, avec le président. Et aussi, j'ai croisé beaucoup cette personnage. Et vous avez montré sa phrase de l'art décoratif aujourd'hui. D'après moi, mais ça on va discuter à l'intérieur aujourd'hui. Il faut sur la contribution centrale des légers, de technologie, d'autres personnes qui vont faire qu'ils se déplacent, nos enfants, mais on ne parle pas ils volent les gars. Et ils vont laisser nothing. Moi, je voudrais qu'ils volent. Parce que les pompiers vont garder de l'approche très haute. Bon, je vois rien, mais on sent dans les années 20, et surtout après 25, on sent qu'ils s'humanisent un peu grâce à sa race élégique, qui est à la guerre, qui l'attire à des questions plastiques, couleurs, sensations, tout ça. Mais il y a une question plus quotidienne qui pousse vers la différence, ce qui après l'exemple de je ne sais pas si vous avez cette hypothèse.
Even know if she was a fashion model or an artist model. We know she was a model. Maybe you know.
Yes, she is a model, a fashion model.
But
yes,
because Francesco Bassanti,
he started also.
He wasn't sure. He knows she was a model, but he wasn't even sure what to think of it.
No, I guess she was model. I must to study all these women that was also creating a new way of life.
She wore in the 30s. She has pants on.
Yeah. But what I think is that she came from popular.
Yes.
Yes. And then she brings to make a poorest view to day and day. When we look the vacations, the holidays that they spent in the frame that spent at work, when we look at the day life of the group,
how they live. So different from 25. Yes. Then we have antiques evolving, and I don't know when she begins because the Corbusier was very authoritative.
Yeah. I think by 27, she's really gone, and by 30, when he gets married, definitely. But they lived together for quite a few years.
Julia heard that.
Yeah, but I was before they were married. They were living in Rouge à Pau together.
Yes, I mean, because we must see also in personal terms, meaning affective terms, the whole of enfants.
Yes.
Then we must put a kind of game, but I don't want to try. I'm so happy you are here.
I would love more on the Don.
I don't know if I'm but I need to
Find the information.
but we must turn to her.
I think she did have an influence. I talked to lots of people about her. She was earthy. She used bad language. She had no trouble making fun of people. And everybody said she was a very good cook. She had everybody, even though she speaks movingly of how she would have him to for dinner, even when Peru was out of town, she would take care of some of the young foreign office people. The people I knew, which you may have met, Roger Jean, or any of the people, they speak very fondly of the
And I don't know when exactly she begins to have problems, psychological.
Yeah, and she did drink.
But of course, it's not so good.
Yeah.
This is the problem.
Yeah, he wasn't so easy, and sometimes he got drunk too.
But I would like to know with people that I now we have people from all Brazil listen. I don't know if they will come to you, but next beginning July, and we have thesis, doctoral thesis, on the first Brazilian architect that has his diplomation from this university thesis about la femme et l'architecture between 1970.
Wow.
Je n'ai pas encore le texte, je n'ai pas encore, mais ça sera pour le mois de juillet, je pense. Et à São Paulo.
I look forward to that.
I understand, and it is very
Sério, sorte mesmo, sério. Esse é uma evolução. Legal.
Nous avons eu, je ne sais pas si vous avez entendu déjà parler de Carmen Portinho.
I don't know.
La femme de Rio, la femme
Oh, the wife of Brady.
Yes. Without her, he will be known.
Yeah.
Because he was why? Because he was engineer, excellent
How do you
engineer.
spell Carmen? Yeah, I did hear her Carmen. Okay.
And we have also a very interesting woman that the name is Lita.
Yes,
Macedo Soares.
Yes, she was Elizabeth Bishop.
It's been right.
Actually,
She is.
yeah.
We need to write.
Lots of stories.
Soares. Macedo Soares. I wrote a little for concerning the collaborative aspect, because I guess that the most problem, the most important problem we have is that the collaborative aspect of architecture, les différents types d'intelligence qui sont nécessaires pour faire qu'une œuvre se réalise, nous ne prenons pas le processus entre l'œuvre et l'œuvre, c'est toujours auteur, et pas de l'ensemble de la constitution de l'office, du bureau.
We do need, and
She was has a not only feeling concerning knowledge, but also very good administrator.
she is having everything done.
And without that, builders.
And it's amazing because Flamingo Park doesn't have without.
Yes, and from the park, I give you very little catalog where I put the political intelligence, the administrative intelligence, the biologist intelligence, because we need to adapt the landscape and the winds, the salt in the winds to the plants. Mines, infrastructure, like salt, ground intelligent. 5 or 6 profiles, different profiles
That she could bring together.
otherwise we
Because
didn't
all
have.
I've read is the little book that it talks about. Is any of her house still exists that she did with Elizabeth Bishop? The house she designed?
Outside, yes, it's a farm. It's not a farm, but
Rustic.
rustic. Yes, yes. It was we have so much things, so much things we must study, and in Columbia University and the new school also. It's very important because the new school, as we know, was created by Columbia teachers
For the immigrants.
before the war. I don't know, do you want to go through what we did?
Yeah, why don't I?
Yes, I was talking with
I'm
sorry,
learning.
we are speaking English and French and Portuguese.
I want to learn more about Rochi's wife. Yeah. The other person I want to learn more about is Anita Clevin in Art Clubbing.
Ah, sim.
Ela tem a casa, she has a house in Lagoon, from this clubbing house in Lagoon. There's
Eva Clabin and their family, a member of the family. And I have a mother in the family, Clabin in Rio. Not in São Paulo, I can call. Okay, it's a very quick use. Eu falo péssimo inglês, então eu falo metade inglês, metade francês. E a minha cabeça está ficando ó. E aí? Ela fala inglês excepcional. aquela moça, eu estava falando para ela, gente que vem lá de São Paulo, juntada com uma tese, mas não deve ser o original. A menina que trabalhou sobre a primeira Camila. Cadê a Camila? Não conheço o pessoal. A primeira pessoa que começou a trabalhar nessa SUS, foi a Silvia. Primeiro que começou a estudar na cidade, nesses rapazes que ganharam prêmio, e a senhora, eu falei para ela, ensinar para mim, isso na pele. Eu sei porque as coisas. Tem alguma na pele? Esse curso não é inscrito, não.
Estava falando da Camila pela que pessoas do mundo.
Eu vou ser da banca.
Qual Beto?
O quê? A Camila? Manda para ela saber por quê. Eu não sei se eu tenho a tese dela está marcada, acho que foi eu acabei de dizer a data, eles estão com eles, é fim de 3. Eu acho que não me lembro disso. Eu já falei ela é mais além da Silvana, e eu esqueci de cuidar do meu pai. Lembrei de perguntar se agora, não sei, não falei para ela, eu acho que
É que eu acho que eu queria mudar.
tem vantagens, os estudos estão eu tenho que assinar essa lista de presença, sabe? Senão no futuro vai ser igual o Mário de Andrade. Mário de Andrade ficou resfriado. Um dia da semana de 22, ninguém fala dele na semana de 22, como se ele não tivesse papel nenhum, ele ficou resfriado. Então, se eu não assinar essa lista, amanhã vão falar, não, aquela pessoa não se interessava por nada. E eu nem me
Mara, I forget which one was the good one.
You have to touch, then you make case and make noise.
Is this one? Or is it this?
This
is
one
it.
is better. Alguém não assinou a lista de presença? Eu vou assinar e depois vou deixar tudo em cima, tá?
Do the students want to come up? Well, I'll let you decide how to do it. I could start with some questions and then, yeah? Yes, but why don't you say something? Just a sec.
Vocês nos ouvem aí no Zoom? A gente está retornando aqui do intervalo. A Mary vai colocar algumas perguntas, algumas questões, e a gente vai abrir para os alunos, tanto no Zoom quanto pessoalmente, poderem responder as perguntas dela e também colocar outras perguntas. Então, vocês podem ir chamando por aqui que a gente vai organizando aqui pelo...
Você pode pegar mais informações?
Se alguém quiser perguntar em português, pode se sentir mais confortável de perguntar em português, podem perguntar em português que a gente faz a tradução.
Yes, sure. And there was one question right there. Introduce yourself.
Okay, so I am Priscilla. I am a student.
Hi. So I'm Priscilla. I'm a student here in ProUBI in the PhD first year. So Priscilla. Yes. And unfortunately, we also have another course in the afternoon, so we should leave soon. my colleagues of the other class. But first, thank you so much for your lecture. It was very inspiring watching you as a woman talking and value the work of many women that was forgotten or, unfortunately. And my question is actually about one of these women you mentioned, Denise Scott Brown. Because also coincidentally we have a course that we are going to do in the afternoon about Venturi and Denise.
Great.
And so we are studying her and it's like many things that happens to her throughout the career and until today, because she's still alive. And so as an American woman, and very important woman, she faced many challenges. First in the salary, because she was working harder and more time than Victoria, and she had a smaller salary. Then after she was also mentioned many times as a less important collaborator. And then there was the Pritzker Prize in 1901 that was only for Venturi, and she wasn't there, and it was a big issue. I signed the petition in 2013, and so for me it's one of the cases of the most unfair thing that happened. And when you mentioned all the steps, and I love that, like first inclusion and then rhetoric and institutions organization, I would love to answer that about Brazil, but it's many things, and I love that. But I was just curious to know a little bit your point of view about Denise, if you could talk a little bit, because for me, I don't think she's been included. For example, it's a bit a situation that I don't know if we could mention, for example, her position in terms of these steps. That would be amazing. I don't know how to correct all the injustice. I don't know. So I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about her.
I have to get the mic again with the Zoom. It's a great question, and I'm very fortunate because I actually know Denise quite well, partly because her sister lived with one of my closest friends. Ruth Lahotsky lived with Robin Middleton, who is a colleague of mine at Columbia, so I've become very close to Denise over the years. By the way, do you know the little monograph by Frida Graham? Okay, because that just came out. And I had a lot of fun helping Frida get photos and things. I think Denise is a really interesting example. I actually will show tomorrow the Pritzker Prize thing, just briefly, because she does hit many of those models. She wasn't, Venturi had probably mostly designed, for instance, his mother's house before Denise's close relationship. They knew each other before that. So he was already recognized somewhat as a designer. And I think Denise, because she did almost all the urban design in the office, that wasn't seen as important as the other kind of design, which is one of the biases I think we have to address. She was paid less at Yale. He had the name chair. She was working just as hard, if not harder. She wrote the studio program at the famous Las Vegas studio, and yet she earned less money. And Denise is really interesting because she came to the firm as a partner before really second generation, what we call the second wave feminism or the women's lib movement in the early 70s. She's just becoming a partner. And she talks about how the experience of discrimination being ignored by the press or dismissed by the press, actually radicalized her and made her more feminist. And she wrote a really early article, which I love. Some women find it problematic, but I don't, on the bathroom. And anybody in the US, I don't know if you have this trouble in Brazil, if you go to the theater or the movies, anything, there's a line for the women's room and no line for the men's room. Or you get in the bathroom, there are no hooks if you have a purse or a bag. All the things that women need. She wrote this very practical but kind of amusing, witty essay just on the bathroom as an object of spatial discrimination. And I love that, and she did that very early on. And one of her early articles about sexism in the profession, she actually gave as a talk very early, but she didn't publish it till like the late 80s because she didn't want, in a way, for the office to get discriminated against. She said the one critic who was fair to her was a woman critic, Ada Louise Huxtable. And she was one of the few critics writing in the New York Times who consistently credited Denise's role. What I'm amazed with Denise, I think she's angry and maybe even somewhat bitter about that discrimination. But I also think what's really impressive is how she always supported younger women. And some of the earlier women who were successful were a bit grand dame, successful women in a men's world. I don't know if, sometimes I've heard Lena described that way. I don't know if that's fair or not. What's interesting about Denise is I don't think she ever felt that way. I think she genuinely really sought to support young women in the office. Even how she runs her household is almost like a collective, a commune. She's always having young students living in the house, etc. I don't know what else I could say about her. She was an early participant in women's organizations in architecture. And just as a scholar, I feel like she's very supportive of me. She adores Frida Graham, who edited this volume, despite being very prickly and opinionated. I did sign for some of the readings for the last class, which I really hope will be more of a seminar with presentations. Her wonderful exchange with Kenneth Frampton. Did you read that? Learning from Pop and then Pop Off? Okay, it should be posted. Mara may have posted it. This is two people that I love dearly, both over 90. Kenneth Frampton was very, very critical of learning from Las Vegas. He saw it as commercialism, selling out, denigrating leftist politics, a horrible compromise. Denise, and it was an issue in the Casa Bella in December '71, if my memory isn't getting blurry. Denise responds in the most witty, wonderful way, making fun of Kenneth Frampton's prose. Sharp, acerbic, funny. I think some of the great lines, even though Venturi wrote the first rough draft of Learning from Las Vegas, not the studio portion at the beginning. The really acerbic comments about archograms, space age, tech, I'm sure they're Denise's voice. Because if you read this essay, Pop Off, responding to Kenneth Frampton, it's pure delight. She's saying he doesn't pay attention to the lower middle class. He's an East Coast snob, kind of sitting in his Ivy League chair, one of these academic Marxists. And it's a very funny exchange. And as I said, I like them both. I have sympathy in some ways for both of their positions, but I think Denise, in my mind, won that battle. So, yeah. Thank you, Priscilla.
Se quiser falar ali, Luísa, na câmera, talvez seja melhor ver o pessoal ver. Mary, please. Maybe it's better if you go near the camera, then the people in Zoom can see you.
Oh, okay. You should go near the camera first when you ask the question. Oh, so be careful, it blinds you.
Mas eu vou ficar de costas pra ela. E agora?
Como fica melhor?
Não sei, se eu ficar aqui, não.
You have to
Então,
sit
se eu
up
ficar...
here, I think the camera's there.
Talvez aqui seja melhor. Ah, que bom. Foi? Ficou bom assim? Hello. Hi. My name is Luisa Gonçalves. I'm a professor at the Architectural Design Department. Recently got here. And I'd like to thank you, of course, for this wonderful lecture. I've learned a lot. I have two questions.
Sure.
The first one is kind of a methodological approach, because I've really liked that you said about taking down some gender stereotypes around women and their production in architecture, such as women not making skyscrapers and etc. And I was thinking if we should, or if you have seen that, doing that the same in parallel as for men, if the men's architectural history has also been revised or should, around the same stereotypes. And I was thinking about personal life as well, and I was glad that the last slide you talked about it. So I think that women's career has always been crossed by having a lot of children and their domestic role in their lives, and I was wondering if interviews with men, for instance, would approach this as well, like if the kids' issue, the domestic issues, but also men doing domestic design, interior design, and all of that. So that's one question. And the other one is, of course, we've seen all the amazing books that you brought us, and they are all written by women, of course. But I was also thinking, in your experience around the world and in lectures and in the United States, how have you perceived some change or any change at all in men's discourse? How have they absorbed those questions, if they have this gender actual current issues? So thank you.
Those are great questions. And I think one of the exciting turns for me is that I do think feminism, by almost definition, has to change male perspectives as well, and has brought changes. And maybe even the whole sort of rise in interest in queer issues in architecture is a response in part, just like gay activism in the US, I don't know if this was true in Brazil, learned a lot from the women's movement. I think similarly, architectural history, many men have rethought things because of women writers, women activists, etc. And I agree. Hopefully, male designers who are primarily interior designers will get recognition and not be dismissed as secondary or somehow effeminate. I don't know if there'll be time today, I might show tomorrow, if not. Someone like Robert Adam in the late 18th century was accused, we don't know if he was gay or straight, we don't really know, and those categories really don't get codified until later. But he was called effeminate all the time. And is that because he had delicate interiors for classical? It wasn't just Rococo that was criticized by late 18th century architects. Robert Adam was both celebrated and criticized. And you wonder how much how oppressed males are by notions of gender stereotypes. And of course, a lot of the practical institutional issues that you mentioned, like childcare, flexible schedules. As men want to change their roles in family structures and women hope they change their roles, your generation will have a lot more luck than mine. Mine had a lot of rhetorical male feminists who didn't put it always into practice. But anyway, I think they too will be pressing. In the US, I think one of the real reasons for the glass ceiling, and there are still, most firms, partnerships are still very male, is because there aren't flexible time schedules. There's still an ethos of charrette, that you have to work 12 hours a day if you're an early a student coming out of school working in an office. I don't know if the situation is more humane in Brazil or not, but office culture in the US, those early years, is pretty brutal. So I do think there are both lessons that male historians, male architects can still gain from feminist studies, but I also think some of them are gaining them and learning. And of course, the first big monograph on Lima in English was by a man, Zuller Lima, who's gay. But there were monographs in Portuguese before. Yeah. And someone like Mark Wigley likes to think of himself as a feminist. Some feminists railed back, does he have to own that too? But he definitely has talked about rhetoric and gender issues. And there are others as well. And I would love to hear more about what's happening in Brazil. But do you have this issue of the glass ceiling in Brazil? I mean, I look all these women students, you think the profession is definitely going to change? Or do we have another kind of discrimination called the feminization of the profession, where architects are now seeing the way librarians and elementary school teachers as a kind of lower tier profession, therefore women are welcome? I mean cynical, but is that an issue?
Marina, fala daqui, eu acho que daí o pessoal consegue te
Hello. First, I'd like to thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting. My name is Marina. I'm an architect and a professor. And I've been studying feminism and urbanism since around 2 years ago. And I'd like to share something.
Sure.
Okay. The first that you asked us to bring some lectures in Portuguese and Spanish.
Yeah.
And I'd like to tell you about the work of Camila Bellarmino. I think that Margaret has already talked of her to you.
Camila
Bellarmino. She is a history research, and she studies the first women that have graduated. And
she mentioned her.
Yeah. And she is the first one in Rio. It was a woman called Arinda Sobral, and she is engaged in her work, and she has a little chapel in the Alto da Boa Vista. This was her first work, and she was promoting her work. And you also remind me the work of Zaida Mushi in Spanish. She has I thought that he was had a lot of similarities for her work, because she is trying to
to tell the history of the architectural woman, all of the twins, and but with a focus in American Latin as well, and European, because she's from Argentina, but she lectured at University of Catalonia. She is and a curiosity that you talked about the bathrooms.
Yes.
I don't know if anyone here knows, but in the Congress in Brasilia,
Yeah.
the building of the Congress had not a bathroom for a woman until 2010. Just when Dilma was the president, that they actually built a bathroom for women, because there was no place for women. And the Congress, there was no place for women. That's it. Thank you.
That is great. Actually, I want to figure out a way you can give me your book or article suggestions. Maybe you send it to Mara, and then she can send it, because I'm very eager to learn more, and I'm so encouraged to hear about this new research happening. I'm amused by the bathroom story too. Sometimes I think I get obsessed with bathrooms and kitchens, so you'll have to forgive me. But they are part of our daily life, and they're part of architecture, and just like we can't ignore the personal, we can't ignore these spaces that we use. But a bathroom story. When I was at Princeton when they just first admitted women. I was in a class of only 20. My architecture, the whole university, when I was an undergraduate, I was 22 of about 1,000, so it was very male. And I was the only woman in my very small architecture class at Princeton. But the second year I was there, we had 2 transfer students, and we decided we needed to do a little action. So we liberated a bathroom. And I think now we all have gone further, where we have gender-free bathrooms, we deal with other bathroom issues. But again, the idea that some space that was dismissed as so secondary has such important both daily life ramifications, but political ramifications. I don't know if you've heard the ridiculous stories about North Carolina and the bathroom laws, but I mean, these are really became where whole companies refused to invest in North Carolina until because they had this absurd law. So these are issues I think we have to include. I don't know if I addressed all of the points. But so I'm very interested to hear about the Building Congress. Thank you.
We have a question here on Zoom.
Okay.
Giovana, você nos ouve? Consegue abrir o microfone para fazer a pergunta?
Eu não sei se você tem razão, depois a gente começa a eu quero insistir sobre o eu quero voltar ao político.
Giovana nos ouve? I'm trying to see if they are hearing us. There is a question here on Zoom.
So while we're waiting for it to work, I'd love to hear your reactions about the glass ceiling and the feminization or not of the profession. Am I being too cynical or not?
I don't think so, but I'm not sure if I've inserted into a bubble, this bubble. From my point of view, I see women seen as powerful actors in the architectural scene. That's one thing. I don't see the other ones too. We have more women architecture as professors, as institutional leaders, organizations, politics, and so on. So,
in the department of projects, the women, they are
The question I would have, it's amazing how schools have become very women-dominated in some places.
And I think in Brazil it was much earlier. I still remember when I first went to Salvador, there was a woman dean, I think Ana Fernandez, if I'm remembering. And I asked, I said, this is amazing, you have a woman dean. We had no women deans at Harvard, Princeton, Columbia. And they said, oh, because the men are all making more money out there practicing. Now, if that's the cynical answer, the more positive answer is what you're just saying, that women are leaders. And I'm encouraged to hope that it's really changing. I just know in the States that practice, my women students feel so strong, so powerful, and then they feel, after a couple years of practice, really frustrated. But I think we have a Zoom question first, Marguerite. So, is it working?
Giovana, você nos ouve? Consegue fazer a pergunta?
Giovana, você nos ouve aí no Zoom? Consegue fazer a pergunta? I think she's not answering.
Is she muted? Ask her if she's muted.
Tá mudo, Giovana? A gente não te ouve.
Estamos escutando.
Agora sim, agora sim.
Ah, o vídeo funcionou agora também.
Pode falar. She's here.
Yeah.
Hello, Professor Mary.
Hi.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound very clear. You sound very clear.
Oh, good. My name is Giovana. I'm a PhD student from Mackenzie University in São Paulo.
Okay.
I'm from South Brazil. I'll be person on Wednesday lecture. I came to go today.
Great.
Yes. I have one question and one question out of curiosity. You mentioned that you're very eager to learn about our feminist history in Brazil and how we are rewriting history here. And my research is very particular about rewriting history in South Brazil, especially in the capital state, Curitiba. I don't know if you have ever heard about the city.
Yes, of course.
Oh, great.
I haven't been, but I've certainly, it's a bit mythic.
Yeah, and so through our research, it's hard to tell if the women in history were erased on purpose or because of like male ego, and sometimes my doubt is about like methodological about your methodological like research. How do you find yourself to search and try to rewrite history, including women with the material you find? That's like my main doubt and my main challenge.
It is a challenge, and I don't know if this is also the case for the student working on the history of women in education, but I co-edit, as I mentioned, this website, Pioneering Women of American Architecture, and many of the women we deal with quite intentionally are not very well known. They all have to be born before 1940, in other words, before second wave feminism hit and the field expanded. And we do things like, I don't know if you can see me, Giovanna, but we use obituaries, we contact children, sometimes the obituaries, because they never get obituaries hardly in the New York Times or the Washington Post, we go to little regional papers, alumni magazines like Vassar Weekly, to dig down, I tried to trace relatives. I remember with Harris Brown, Georgia Louise Harris Brown, Roberta Washington, and Anat Fabel. I had the hardest time tracing one of the children who actually changed sex. So it was very hard to find, but we got a memoir in the end, which really helped a lot. And so it's often kind of devious means of finding regional libraries. Many of these women did not leave archives. The one thing I did not mention, I don't know if it's a strategy or not, but we need more archives. We need to encourage current women to give their papers. We need to encourage relatives and children who may have letters and documents to give their materials as well. I find it like detective work, trying to do research on some of these women. But it's a lot of fun. I have a lot, it's like a challenge. And the other strategy I would really encourage for those who are still alive is oral history. Denise Scott Brown, for instance, has been interviewed a lot. You can gain a lot. The risk of it is when they've been interviewed a lot that they repeat the same story. So you have to really do your homework and try to get beyond generalizations. I don't know if that helps. But you really, when I said personal is political, I think the personal also needs to be the strategy to find things that are not in public archives.
Absolutely. Yeah, that helps a lot. And my other question is more like a quick curiosity.
Yeah.
I think all of us, like women that are researching the history of those architectural women, we all have a personal roots and a personal interest into this. So, and I'd like to know what was like when you started researching. What was your personal interest to do so? Like what was the path that led you to do to get deep in this path?
Okay, I guess it's my time to be personal. I was very fortunate in a way because I came to college in 1968. Should I be talking into?
She's also muted.
Yeah. I came to college in '68 at the height of the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam protests, and the very beginning of feminism. It's something I'll try to show tomorrow, but not from a personal point of view, that really generated this first wave of histories like Doris Cole's little book. And for me, I went to college just as all this was happening, and I was a feminist. I read Kate Millett's Sexual Politics. I read, people that were a bit older than me had already read Betty Friedan that I suggest for tomorrow's class. But a whole wave of feminist books not to do with architecture came out, and it influenced me greatly. And I can't tell you, there's nothing to radicalize you like going to an all-male school like Princeton. I was very fortunate. There was a wonderful librarian, actually Mexican background, Angela Cobb, and she founded the Princeton University Women's Organization. She got me involved with it. We campaigned for things like pregnancy leave, which, by the way, Columbia did not have when I had my daughter much later. I was fortunate to be part of a generation. I think for women a bit older than me, it was much harder because they did not have this community of women supporting them. And I was fortunate that way. I don't know if that answers. Oh, by the way, I can give you one more answer. I was very lucky. I was teaching a Paris program in the late 70s when I first started in France. And I was teaching with Valtraude Woods, who was Shadrach Woods. I don't know if you know his work from Pandillas, Yosek, and Woods. Widow. And she was the one who actually introduced me to Charlotte Perriand. And Charlotte volunteered to talk for 2 whole mornings to our students. And it interested me, but I didn't think of working on her. But I realized what a rich, wonderful career she had. And later, when I was invited to be in the first session on women architects at the Society of Architectural Historians in 1985, I gave a little talk. And then I wrote a short article, but I thought that was it. Then it was a Brazilian woman, Esther da Costa Meyer, who taught at Princeton later, and I don't know if you know her work. She's a wonderful architectural historian. She said to me, Esther da Costa Meyer, she said, Mary, we have lots on Eileen Gray. We have a little bit on Lily Wright, who worked with me, so it's an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. We have no monograph on Charlotte Perriand. And basically, we still think of, at MoMA, the chairs that she worked on were still considered Le Corbusier chairs. So she said, Mary, why don't you do something? So it was actually Esther, another feminist, who's inspired me to do an exhibition of her work at the Architecture League in New York, a very modest exhibition that Charlotte, by the way, totally redesigned, and then to do a monograph on her. And then it was like an avalanche. All these books came out on her. Her son-in-law, in fact, was inspired to work on her, and it became another industry, if you will.
There is another person here, Luisa. Do you want to talk? Luisa has raised her hand.
Yeah, Margaret, and then you. Okay.
Very quickly. Take some time.
It's better if you sit there because then the persons on Zoom can see you.
Mary, I would like to take the microphone. Yeah, because I must to thank you publicly what I told you in private way for your lecture. It was very, very depth, very, very interesting for many aspects that I think we will go to discuss the next day. I would like to apologize because my English is very, very bad. I don't think
Well,
so
my
fast.
Portuguese is
So
worse.
fast. But also, I would like to share with you that maybe we are looking for our audience here and over there. I think that we must to bring our point of view because we are another generation.
Yes.
And as you finish your lecture, underline that the personal aspects are political ones. That was something that we struggled in the 70s. I'd like to make not a question, but a point for reflection. The first one is about bathroom. In the 70s, we had schools in the world, not in US, not in Brazil, but in France. We had schools. The more open universities didn't have men and women bathroom. I studied at Vincennes.
Yes.
And as I said, during all my studies in Versailles, in the end of the 70s, we didn't have male bathrooms, women bathrooms. We think that we go to the bathroom.
Yeah.
And this is a point that I bring to our discussion because two aspects I would like to underline. One, about your strategies, your points.
Yeah.
Editions also is a very important publisher, very important.
Yes.
Because we had by the beginning of 2000, from 2000 to now, we had maybe a publisher that still are very close in a masculine authors. And I say that because linen, for instance, studies begins by women here in Brazil. Silvana Rubino, maybe she's with us today, a professor of Unicamp, University of Campinas, that began the studies on linen Barbie. But this is after this disappeared in verified for the other generations, and sometimes with all the contributions that the new generation brings, but erase first efforts.
Yeah.
This is the problem. The second problem is also like the question, if we are very, I guess that the revolution we are making with gender studies is that we are open the field about collaborative practice more than gender, or we are open to collaborative in any way, in any aspects, in any fields. I don't know if you agree, but this is it will be also a great revolution. Je support. I gave my support, of course, to all the initiative, all the issues, all je donne tout mon appui à toutes les initiatives, bien sûr, qui nous montrent la différence qui existe, la pluralité des modes d'être au monde. Et donc, dans ce sens, bien sûr, toute la discussion de gender est très très positive. Mais c'est beaucoup plus large encore, c'est beaucoup plus collaboratif. Je ne sais pas si toi, tu agris avec ça. C'est-à-dire, toujours, je pense qu'il faut souligner les différences, à la fois comme les différences, mais à la fois faire l'effort de la remettre dans un champ plus politique, plus large. Et donc, en ce qui concerne Oscar Niemeyer et les bathrooms du Congrès, je ne sais pas s'il a fait ça parce qu'il était de gauche, humaniste, ou s'il a fait ça parce qu'il était un homme. Vous comprenez ce que je veux dire? C'est beaucoup plus complexe, c'est ce que je veux dire. Bon, merci beaucoup et excusez-moi de vous parler à la fois en anglais et en français. Bon, merci.
I won't fully answer, but I can't stress enough this collaborative, multifaceted, and often, sometimes it is the left that opens up, sometimes it's not. A bad example, as opposed to a good example, was Stokely Carmichael's famous line, the best place. I don't know if you know, Stokely Carmichael was a very famous black activist, and he was a total sexist at one point in his life. I think he had a reformed later life, where he said the best position for women is prone. So sometimes leftists can be very supportive, sometimes not. I think a lot of women do work with their partners. The very positive side, if it's a heterosexual partnership, is that they can take turns with childcare, running households, etc. When that happens, it's great. It doesn't always happen. One of the early practices that really put an emphasis on it, you may know about the Architects Collaborative, or TAC, where there were 2 women partners from the beginning, and they even shared a house in the beginning where they hired help together to help with household, but they took turns and rotated things like childcare. Later, they developed a suburban community outside of Boston, where again, there were collaborative activities. So it isn't just collaborative practice, it's collaborative lifestyles that sometimes permit better inclusion of women. But I love the point about publishing. And I want to give credit to 2 presses in the US that were very important for including women architectural history. And the first was Princeton Architectural Press, run by a former student who was in school with me, a guy named Kevin Lippert. But not only did he publish books I was really involved with in my youth, like Architecture Criticism, Ideology, Architecture Reproduction, but he published Architecture and Feminism, Architecture of the Everyday. He was one of the people who was really open, because he was of the generation of women's lib, to women's studies. And a lot of those books in the 90s that I showed were Princeton Architectural Press books. Sadly, he died quite young. The other person is a woman who was a big editor at Abrams, Diana Murphy. And she not only published my Perion book, she went to a conference I organized, but she published Alice Friedman's book that I showed you about women patrons. And Diana, she also published Mira Nakashima's book on her father and her practice. Diana, while she was at Abrams, was a major force on publishing women designers, and later other books in her other roles at Metropolis Books, etc., promoted women authors, women designers, etc. So I think those ways of recognizing parts that organizations, institutions that support the profession in history is really critical. Like I mentioned, archives, but publishing is obviously very critical. And the same with magazines. I can't emphasize enough the role that Kathleen McGuigan had at Architectural Record as editor. She began awards for women. The current editor of Architectural Review in London is a woman. She's brought women to prominence. And long-term writers, whether it's Ada Louise Huxtable in the Times or Suzanne Stevens, who for years worked at Progressive Architecture and then Record, they have brought attention to women people. So women writers, women journalists, women publishers, all of them I think have been very important to it. I would really like to give them credit. I don't know if anyone on Zoom wants to ask.
Oh, there's some here. Yeah.
Come here,
This is intimidating.
No, I'm so glad we had at least half of the other sex represented.
So that's one of the questions I wanted to bring. First of all, thank you so much for the lecture. And this issue is really important to me as a queer person. Okay. So, and for that said, I would like for us to look at the audience and I wanted you to discuss about the need to differentiation to be included.
Yeah.
So as this need that I'm saying we because I'm including queer and feminism. Okay. We need to be different than to be recognized, and I think Despina talks about it a little bit in her book. I wanted you to say about that, and when Margaret brings the example for the bathroom before the 70s, the need to create a separate bathroom is maybe the reinforcement of inclusion, but as well as a differentiation. And I think this is like a little mix for the queer theory that tries to not only empower one gender, but destroy it all, no? So this is one thing, because for now, again, the bathroom example, if we talk about non-binary people, we are in Brazil and some other places, they're trying to create a third kind of bathroom. So isn't that another differentiation to be included? So I wanted you to see that. And when with the text from Forte, Adrian Forte, I think languages is really an issue, and you said you brought one of the points of rhetoric. And I think Margaret is also a really good PhD on that, I don't know. Because in English you have genre and gender, and in Portuguese both words are together, and in French I think so also. And the translation between those two, and for example architecture in Portuguese is a feminine word, and I was wondering, and you mentioned that some of the buildings in the Forte text were described as feminine, and the only quality was the building to be manly and to be garo and stuff, and the other things are inexplicit. Okay, and it was like boxed in the feminine characterization. And I would like to know, and if you know, that if the men that produced those feminine buildings were stigmatized as feminine, because this, I think, made me reflect about how authorship influences how we read architecture. And this is one of my main reflections nowadays, because when we talk about feminism, urbanism, and inclusion of gender issues, how can we design without characterization the form of, because like in the classicism, like curves were feminine and straight lines were male things. So this too, I don't know if I was clear. Thank you.
I don't know if we should put on the gender slides, maybe. These are all great questions, and I think that tension you first mentioned about inclusion, diversity, versus obliterating difference. What is the goal? Do we want to encourage difference but be inclusive, or do we want to abolish difference? And I think this is a tension, actually, in both feminism, queer politics. In fact, we had I taught a class for the first time since the 90s. I'll tell you a little about my classes, about women and gender this spring. And some of my, there were two women in the class who identified as queer or lesbian, and one of them wrote an essay, why had the word lesbian disappeared, and what was the problem with it disappearing under what seems like the more inclusive umbrella of queer. This is English rhetoric. I don't know how it works in Portuguese. And there was a lot of discussion, because the situation, the words that were used in the 80s during the AIDS crisis, gay men had a different experience than lesbian women. One reason, the people I know that have the most trouble with queer rhetoric are my gay male friends of my age, because they feel like they had to choose a particular identity to fight this plague, this curse that they were facing. Some of my lesbian friends thought gay men, they made more money statistically. Every curator of architecture but one at MoMA has been a gay man. No women have yet been curators of architecture. So the experience is different within this broader umbrella term. On the other hand, there's shared qualities of difference, oppression, stigmatization, especially depending on where you live. It varies a lot. In rural America, it's still probably quite difficult to come out as a 12 or 13-year-old as gay or queer or lesbian, however word you want to use. But there's also something wonderful about the fluidity of choice right now, and that people don't feel like they have to be categorized. And the bathroom debate reflects all of that completely. And somebody told me that the people at Yale, they took a survey about how to deal with the bathrooms in the architecture school. And strangely, it was most of the foreign women who were most against having gender-free bathrooms because they couldn't deal with the mess that men made. So that was one argument. Others, think it's crazy. The solution at the Whitney Museum, the new one, is to have different cubicles so everybody has a private bathroom. I don't have one answer on all of this, but I think it's an interesting, rich debate, and we have to just keep exploring solutions. But I think the goal of inclusiveness is important. My first class that I ever taught in '91 that dealt with women or gender issues was half men and half women. And not all the men were gay or queer. And it was an amazing class. Many of them have gone on to do important work since then. And I feel thrilled. Someone who was in that class, Mabel Wilson, is one of the leading scholars on race issues now. Others have done interesting work. But the women, we wrote journals in that class, and the women all complained that the men talk too much. So who knows? In my current class, I have only a smattering of men. One is gay, queer, the other two are straight. Who knows what all of this means? And I think that question of whether, the question I posed at the beginning of my lecture is, how can we get men, straight or gay, to be interested in women's issues is a challenge. And I think probably if you're dealing with queer issues, how can you get straight women, straight men, to be interested in these issues? And I think one of the problems for queer architectural studies in the US was Philip Johnson, because he was so chauvinistic. He had all these gatherings at the Century Club when it didn't allow women, that a lot of the women couldn't deal with another part of his identity, which was his queer identity. So we have to deal with intersectionality. And I also think that brings up the example I mentioned earlier, that none of us are saints. We don't need to make heroes out of all the women. We don't need to make heroes of all the men. I hope we are at a stage where we can have more nuanced reflections on what these people bring. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm very grateful for your posing. I don't know if we have a few more minutes or not, or one more.
Yeah, she has prepared.
Okay. Yes, I would love to hear your questions, and I brought images from the Forte reading, and a few others, should you wish them.
Well, good morning for everyone, and thanks for your talk, Professor Mary. But I was wondering at the time there was the presentation about how it's very close, the history of architecture and well, best essay as the lack of the history of women and the history of architecture. And I was wondering about the reality in the art history camp as well.
Okay.
I was, well, before I was starting my speech, my name is Jana.
Joanna?
Jana.
Jana.
Yeah. I forgot to say my name.
J-A-N-A?
Diana.
Oh, Diana.
Yeah, Diana is better.
Okay.
And I am a PhD of urbanism study as well here in Rome. And I am also graduate in art history. And that's why I was thinking about some parallels in reference that principal in Linda Knocklin says, where is the women artists in the history of art? Because there is a kind of camp that is not saying by women, but they are there. And I think that is probably very close to the history of architecture, because here, principally in Brazil, when we say the reference that Marina said, that Arlinda da Cruz Sobral, that was as known as the first woman that graduated in architecture here in Brazil, she was based in the School of Arts here. So we still have this School of Arts, and then they are very close to the School of Architecture. And they are kind of sisters, but their stories went different ways. And when we say that Linda Cruz was the first woman in the history here in Brazil, and she was formed in the beginning of the 20th century, we are saying that in the art there was before women that was formed, that was graduated as well, but we don't know much about them. So this is a kind of parallel that I was thinking in the moment. And sometimes I was wondering as well, the second topic, that when we say that it's kind of an issue, and that is true, that we don't have much visibility in schools of architecture for women. And we are saying that it's a difference of moment. It's very a revolution. We are going to see the whole room with women and professors. But I was wondering the real work and the professional work, and when I read where are the women architects, the second text for this day, there are a topic that say that the professional world is very cruel to principal with mothers and the children. And I was wondering what we can draw, not for the architecture, for the urbanism, but what are the places for the kids and the women that are pregnant. So it's very different model of drawing, and I think it's much closer to the thought as well for Silvia Venedici, like the critical of the capitalism, that the capitalism needs these children for work, for the future work, but at the same time, in the moment when the woman is pregnant, there are problems, something like that. And the last thing I wish to talk is the issue that we now at the moment, we have the possibility to practice a kind of architecture more inclusive, but how we dialogue with the structures and the spaces that are already constructed, and they were built in the vision of man and used for man. And I was saying that because in the first text, like words and buildings, the vocabulary of modern architecture, it's very close to the thought when women were only designed by the design of interiors, and then were for the buildings, for the institutional buildings. And it's kind of a feeling that we still have in the previously buildings, because they had this look by men who draw it, who project and build it. So I think it's a perfect, I don't know, but I think it's a kind of topic to think for the future, but not just build at the present time, but how we can deal with this architecture, this modern architecture, who was built for the form and the structure and the logic that was kind of inflexible, right? So this was the topic. Thanks, Professor.
So much, and I'm sure some of your stomachs are starting to grumble, but I'll try to deal with these great issues raised. I think the interest as a historian, maybe the first one is the easiest for me to deal with, that art history had confronted these issues often before architectural history. And Linda Nochlund's article, which I'll actually cite in my third talk, it really influenced my generation, not just art historians, but architects. And I think just challenging that idea of the white male creative genius and saying that there were institutional and social structures that had a lot to do with how women practiced and entered fields really went beyond painting. And she also did an amazing show at the Brooklyn Museum with Ann Harris about women artists throughout history from the Renaissance on. And when we talk about institutions of publishing, I should also mention museums. Brooklyn Museum, in contrast to MoMA, which was very slow to take up the issue of women, housed the Women in Architecture show in '77, housed the show of Linda Nochlund, and has been very good about women artists consistently. I also might mention that Adrienne Forte, giving you a personal anecdote, wife is Bryony Ferrer, who is a great feminist art historian. So the fact that Adrienne is thinking about gender issues, I mean, he's a very enlightened, wonderful guy in general, but I think was inspired in part by Bryony, and also Griselda Pollock and other important feminist art historians on the British scene. The professional world, actually I was curious, you raised the question that I had for all of you in the audience, if Despina Strategakis' book about entering the field in the glass ceiling was the same in Brazil or not. Because that issue of child care and motherhood is one of the big issues that keeps hitting the profession in the US. There's still a horrible anecdote I can tell you. Again, somebody I like a lot. Harry Cobb, there was a very good woman architect in the office. This is IMK's office, Lindy Evans, and she got pregnant. And she said to him, she was very clearly pregnant, Harry, I'm going to have to take a leave in 2 months. And he said, but we're not finished the project. Can you hold off for another month or two? And he wasn't joking. And I think a lot of corporate firms, especially, still haven't dealt with this issue in the US. It might be different in Brazil. And the children issue, I think, in both design and practice is critical. At Columbia, there's no daycare facility on campus. For graduate students or faculty who have children, what a difference it would make if there would be a facility right there, that you could take your child with you to work, leave them off, pick them up. It would make a world of difference. And I think almost every corporate firm, whether architecture or not, should think about this. It may not have to be in the building, but something close. And there, I think, a lot of socialist countries were way ahead of us. There's an interesting book edited by Marianne Simon and Mary Paczynski about women practitioners in the Eastern Bloc behind the Iron Curtain. They had their own set of problems, but they could enter the state agencies and practice in much bigger numbers in the 50s, before second wave feminism, because there were facilities for daycare, childcare, etc. The US is way behind even Western Europe on this front. I don't know, again, it also raises the issue of class. A lot of Latin American women professionals, if they're of a certain class, I was told this, so correct me if I'm wrong, had servants in the 60s and 70s. When I was in Salvador, this was about 2001, I was staying with a wonderful woman architect, and I said, how can you manage? And she said, well, we have this wonderful person taking care of the children, doing the laundry. That meant that women who had enough money for that kind of support were able to practice. So I think the issue of class has to be addressed. If you no longer have servants, what facilities and institutions can take on that role? How can we make it more democratic so more people have those support systems? Otherwise, being an architect becomes too, we used to say it was a privilege of being at least upper middle class. And one hopes that will change. Was one reason we have so few African American architects in the US. The numbers of black architects are still marginal. What was the last? Dialogue with existing structures. Great point. I certainly don't want to get rid of all these buildings done by white males that are called, manly or heroic, nor do I think all male qualities are to be poo-pooed. I love H.H. Richardson, just as Sullivan did. I would rather take the attitude that we could appreciate. And of course, I'm a non-essentialist. I don't think there's anything essentially male or essentially female. These are historical labels applied to buildings. But I think it's the same issue we have. Do we get rid of all of ancient Rome just because it had slavery, was hierarchical, sexist? They're great buildings. We don't want to rip down the Pantheon, even if the labor that went into it was horrific. Or we don't want to rip down the pyramids that were built by slaves. I think we have to historicize and contextualize these buildings. But I also think where possible, renovate them. So better bathrooms, better child care facilities, maybe break down some of the boundaries between public and private comfort. There are ways we need to rethink spaces, but I'm not someone who just says, destroy the past. I would rather contextualize it.
We only have Sergio wants to send you some greetings. He's here.
Hi. Hi, Mary. Hi, Mara.
Hi, Sergio.
Good
Hi,
morning.
Monica.
Oh, hi, Sergio.
You can use me.
Yes.
Yes. Did you have?
Hi, Mary. You can listen me well?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So, welcome to Brazil with all its turbulence.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your collaboration. In name of the ProPar Unis and Docomomo Sul, South Docomomo, we thank you for you, which has been so important for us, this contact for many years. I had the opportunity to be hosted as a research professor for you on 2 occasions at Columbia, and they were special learning opportunities for me. But now I am very sad, Mary, because you will not able to come to Porto Alegre. But I think there will other opportunities, I hope. So I apologize for the climate.
How can you apologize for nature? It's tragic. I wish I could be there.
And Monica is here also.
I see her. Hi, Monica.
To say hello.
It's great to have you both, and I thank you so much.
How are you guys? I'm so sorry that we can't go to Rio. We are planning to stay, to be there with you guys, but it's very sad what is going on here. And your lecture, Mary, wow, it's amazing. It's a subject that we don't speak too much here in Brazil. So I think this was very important for the students and to bring this subject to the scene in Brazil.
Thank you both so much. I just hope to goodness the South that the city comes back. I'm sure it will, but it's so sad that so many people are displaced and so much work to still be done. And I also, Ila, nice to see you too. It's wonderful that you have this collaboration in Brazil. I would love to see more of that in the States. In some ways, it's just good general politics, but I also think it's feminist to try to work together.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you for all the collaborations, and we see you all tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions very much. I appreciate it.
Tchau, Sérgio. Tchau, Mônica. Tchau, Guilherme.
I want to go see.
Menina, eu vou correndo. Você quer ir comigo ou não?
I didn't even know there was an